When one thinks of a location that has been consistently and heavily fortified against attack from the sea, one usually thinks in terms of decades or possibly a few centuries, and perhaps you think of major ports of well-known maritime powers. But this can be misleading, as quite often those powers' maritime ambitions might only cover a century or two, occasionally more, but even then, assuming that the nation itself has actually existed that long, the importance of specific ports rises and falls with changes in political alignments and technology. Using the UK as an example, Chatham, Invergordon, Scapa Flow and the Nore have at times been critically important to the Royal Navy, but are now largely historical in their association with the Navy and naval defence, whilst even consistently important areas such as Plymouth or Dover have waxed and waned in their fortunes over the centuries. Conversely, in a few select areas of the world, there's been both the habitation and the need for some kind of maritime defence for far longer than any single nation or governmental system has persisted. These tend to be quite few because outside of natural trade corridors, any area with substantial land available can, to a degree, choose not to have anything to do with the sea for a while if it suits them, or if circumstances happen to force it. The Sea People's invasion in the Bronze Age, for example, caused a significant retrenchment from the sea in general for a while. The predations of various raiders and pirates caused similar changes to the Iberian Peninsula during the height of the Barbary era. But in a few places, there was no option. There was nowhere to go, and so some form of defence pops up almost continuously for centuries, perhaps even for millennia. The Channel Islands, in the Channel, or as the French might call it, La Manche, may not spring immediately to mind, but are in fact one of the most perfect examples of this, being placed within a fairly constrained and active seaway, the English Channel, positioned in the middle of excellent fishing grounds, which continue to be something of a hot topic even today, and are themselves relatively fertile with pretty good weather. They've got natural harbours, happen to just be off the coast of what has been for a long time a hostile power to the overall governing power, i.e. France, when England has for the most part had control over the Channel Islands, and themselves are relatively small. This means that for a long time there's been a motivation to live there, a motivation for other people to come and take the islands away from the current inhabitants, and therefore a strong motivation for those inhabitants to build some kind of defence. The island of Jersey is one of the two largest islands in the group and provides a near-perfect snapshot of the status of maritime defences from the very earliest periods all the way through to the 20th century, and includes some unique places that cannot be found anywhere else. Let's take a look at a sample of what the island has to offer. If we journey back to before recorded history, to what's commonly referred to as the Stone Age, there was a period where maritime defence was the last thing on the minds of the locals. There's enough evidence that there were locals, but whilst this rather wide-ranging period saw the construction of some rather substantial fortifications and megalithic structures elsewhere, relatively speaking nearby, the simple fact was that this period also covers, at least in part, a time when the English Channel simply didn't exist in this particular area. And so, without the sea, there was no maritime environment and hence no maritime defence. An outlook that today looks over endless blue waters would at some point instead have looked over a sea of grass, with maybe a hint of blue on the horizon, and the occasional mammoth or aurochs wandering around looking for something particularly interesting to eat. However, times change, and sooner or later the waters rose, and what had been some interesting mountains and plateaus were now the Channel Islands. This introduced the maritime situation, and with it plenty of fish, which leads us on to the Iron Age. This is where we see the first evidence of maritime defences, as we would regard them. Considering that the ranged weapons of the period were largely constrained to slings, spears, bows and arrows and other such weapons, and communications across even such a relatively small island were unlikely to be fast enough to rally the population to oppose a landing in force, the first defences we have evidence for on the island consist of a large earthen embankment or wall that was built on the northern coast of the island, slightly to the east of the centre line. What's left is largely overgrown and has in parts been cut through in more recent centuries to allow access for roads, and in other areas just been outright flattened to allow the building of homes or the farming of fields. But some relatively substantial portions of it survive, as you can see here. The purpose of this wall was to isolate a peninsula of the island from the rest of it, taking advantage of the natural cliffs that characterise much of the north and west coasts of the island to provide defence on 3 sides, with the wall providing the 4th. If a major seaborne incursion landed on the island, the locals could then fall back behind the wall and defend themselves for quite some time, ideally taking any crops and livestock with them, which would put the attacking force on a timer, where the lack of supplies would hopefully force them to withdraw before too long. The advantage of this strategy was in exploiting the relatively small size of the island itself. If you took most of the easily movable foodstuffs with you when you withdrew behind your defences, there wasn't actually all that much area to forage in, and with all other supplies then needing to come by boat, the raiders were unlikely to want to send their only means of transport away for substantial periods of time when there was no guarantee of if or when they'd be back, given that this could leave them at the mercy of some very aggrieved locals should they decide to take the offensive once hunger had weakened the attackers sufficiently. Now, whilst there is a reasonable amount of evidence of Roman presence on the island, there's not a lot of verifiable information about maritime defences in this period, although there is some suggestion of Roman and even earlier fortifications under what was for half a millennia to be the main defence of the island, the fortification system of Mount Orgoi, also known as Gore Castle. As with a good many Roman fortified sites, later generations seem to have simply built over them. In the pre-gunpowder era, the rocky promontory on the east coast of the island offered numerous advantages. Mount St. Nicholas, just further in, was separated from it by a low divide, which offered an excellent killing ground, whilst Mount St. Nicholas itself was well out of range of any projectile weapon that might be based on it. The sheer drop on the east and south, and the steep escarpment to the north, meant that the only viable path of attack was from the west, after a substantial climb, and it overlooked one of the better natural harbours, which meant that a castle, placed atop this location, was able to easily command both land and sea. Plus, if the enemy sea control was not total, you could also resupply the castle from the sea, much like Pembroke Castle in Wales. Construction of the current structure began at the start of the 1200s, when the Duchy of Normandy was divided up and hostilities between the Anglo-Norman Duke kings and the rest of mainland France was beginning to heat up. At first, the structure was relatively simple, but as time went on and the Anglo-Norman holdings first evolved into the Angevin Empire, and then when this began to shrink into one of the last outposts of English authority in or near France, the castle would be upgraded time and time again, gaining new curtain walls and towers and a substantially upgraded keep, layering the defences into a series of gates, killing grounds and wall terraces that I can say from personal experience are quite a daunting and exhausting prospect to scale, even when you're a lightly equipped tourist, never mind having to do the whole thing carrying weapons, kitted up in armour, and having people shooting things at you the entire time, with the exciting prospect of someone trying to bash your head in with a mace or run you through with a sword each time you manage to break through one of up to 7 different gates on your way up. Another fortification was built about 120 years into Gore Castle's reign as the primary defence of the island. Granae Castle was somewhat smaller and located to the extreme northwest of the island. It was not designed to supplant Gore Castle, but rather to offer a slightly different manner of defence. Whilst Gore Castle was an almost entirely military structure built to dominate and administer as much as to defend, Granae was in many ways a much more modern version of the Iron Age embankment wall. Likewise, it occupied a small portion of the northern peninsula and relied on the terrain for a similar defensive profile. It was built primarily to offer a place of refuge for the islanders in the event of an invasion, being somewhat easier to reach for those on the western side of the island than Gore, which might have been invested by the enemy by the time the news reached the locals on the west side of Jersey. However, it had a number of flaws in its design. There were no sally ports for counterattack. Perhaps that would be less needed if you were primarily looking at it as a refuge fortification, but much more tellingly, there was no well for water. After approximately 150 years, during which time Granae was captured twice during various French incursions, the castle fell into disuse and was substantially dismantled to allow the reuse of the stone in the fortification of a nearby manor house under the rather wonderfully titled License to Crenellate. Unfortunately, the last of those licenses appeared to have been issued in the 16th century, but on the other hand, there's no anti-crenellation legislation that appears to have been passed since then, at least as far as I can see, so perhaps I should send an application for such a licence to the Queen. In any case, Gore Castle remained the island's primary defence as the age of gunpowder dawned. This posed a significant problem, though. Curtain walls are great defences against escalade and the siege weapons of the medieval period. They're substantially less durable against cannon fire, and the additional range of these newfangled weapons meant that Mount St Nicholas was now back in play. It was higher than Gore Castle, and a battery of guns established there could thus rain destruction on the central keep over the top of any existing defences. During the Tudor period, an effort was made to address this problem in rather spectacular style. Whereas the older style of defence had a keep and a substantial courtyard within the final layer of curtain walls, the new upgrades used one of the curtain wall layers as an outer perimeter, and then filled in the space between this and the inner walls, along with most of the courtyard, and then extended this entire agglomeration upwards until a massive solid fortification rose adjacent to the original keep, completely physically shielding it from Mount St Nicholas, as well as providing a large flat area atop it for mounting the castle's own guns at a similar level to the offending mountain, which would allow counterfire at any potential opposing battery, and provided an even better vantage point to overlook the sea and fire down on any attacking ships, and providing still more steps for yours truly to climb to bring you this information. Additional gun-based upgrades were made to the castle, from long-range cannon emplacements to short-range internal gun batteries that covered the various approaches through the now thoroughly multi-layered defences. However, a gradual shift in importance to the south coast, to St Helier and St Aubin, combined with the fact that, as a largely improvised series of upgrades, Gore Castle was no longer fully up to modern spec, especially if it was attacked from the sea by the new generations of warships that were heavily armed with their own cannon, since the old keep itself was seaward of the new monolithic installation and would thus be vulnerable. And so Gore Castle gradually fell into disuse as a military defence, shifting over to becoming variously a prison and then a barracks, which some soldiers might see as a little different, given that, as with many government schemes of this nature, it was all done on the cheap. The new centre of maritime defence was now in the south, and construction began in the mid to late 16th century on two structures in St Helier Bay, the smaller Fort Saint-Aubin and the much larger Fort Elizabeth, the latter of which we'll look at now. Named after Queen Elizabeth I by the then governor of the island, Sir Walter Raleigh, this fortification was designed from the start with gunpowder in mind, and was far more oriented toward maritime engagements than previous fortifications had been, which had viewed engagement with ships as a useful secondary role, but whose primary defence against maritime assault had been to repel the troops that those ships had presumably brought with them. This structure was built on a promontory in the middle of the bay. Although it was accessible at low tides, as the sea level would normally drop enough for a dry causeway to link the fort to the island, work started at the southern or higher end in 1594, and about 30 years later the lower northern end was also fortified. Whilst the garrison of troops to help defend the island from landings elsewhere was still an important function, the new fort largely used the terrain to provide defence, with relatively low walls compared to the massive curtain walls of Gore Castle, but these walls were much more substantial in their thickness, and backed up by significant earthworks behind that, as well as heavily armed with cannon, and thus capable of engaging attacking warships with direct fire. The fort's defences proved quite powerful. and the island was a royalist stronghold during the English Civil War, with the fort only falling thanks to a very lucky mortar shell from parliamentarian forces that found the old abbey that had been built there before the fort and incorporated into it, and was perhaps unwisely being used as an improvised store of gunpowder and food supplies. The subsequent loss of both in a substantial explosion would force the surrender of the fort after almost 2 months of siege. As with Gore Castle, Fort Elizabeth would continue to be upgraded as it remained the seat of power on the island in the 17th and 18th centuries. Its next taste of action being during the Battle of Jersey in 1781, when the French invaded yet again. This time, the context being French involvement in the American War of Independence and a desire by the French to both take the island generally, and more specifically to deny a base to British raiders who were maintaining the fine tradition of using French shipyards as an ancillary to the British shipyards by promptly converting large numbers of French ships at sea into British ones, with the associated prize money. This time, the fort was able to repel the French attack sent in its direction, and the invading force was cornered and defeated in St Helier itself in what would later become known as Royal Square. Fittingly, for British battle, the conflict's primary locus also happened to be a pub. However, by this point the writing was on the wall for Fort Elizabeth. The mortar rounds that had caused it problems in the English Civil War had been based on a rise of land just to the east of St Helier. And in this latest conflict, the French troops had landed away from the harbour and marched overland, which had denied the fort's guns an opportunity to engage the invading ships, although perhaps you could argue they had landed elsewhere because of the presence of the fort. Nevertheless, fire and observation from the same rise of land had contributed to the British efforts during this battle, and with the whole existing site of Fort Elizabeth occupied by the already established fortifications, there simply was no real space for further changes to be made. Whilst a number of smaller forts had been constructed over the past centuries, in addition to the major seats of power that Gore and Elizabeth represented, the wars with the French in the late 18th century had already begun a new wave of fortification around the island, starting in 1780 with the first of a series of round tower defences named Conway Towers after the governor of the time, who initiated the construction of these small but heavily armed defensive installations. At first, designed to have a small garrison of troops, they were soon upgraded to also take a small cannon or carronade atop them, the purpose being to see off small raiding ships, cause problems for larger landings like the one in 1781, and provide a warning to the rest of the island that perhaps something was going on. This was followed in the early 19th century by a series of true Martello towers and a few small forts in key bays away from St Helier. But the centrepiece of these new works was to be the third major seat of power in the island, taking over from Fort Elizabeth, Fort Regent. This was constructed on the rise of land mentioned earlier, just to the east of the then current spread of St Helier, and was made up of a combination of an elongated star fort and more general fortified embankments and cliffs. Due to the nature of the rise that it was built on, Fort Regent is actually quite linear for an early 19th century fortification, but it's still a very substantial structure that was provided with all the benefits of Industrial Revolution era technological improvements. However, its history is relatively quiet, as by the time it was completed the British Empire was at its height, and despite periodic war scares with France, no major conflict, or any real threat of one in the English Channel at least, developed. So the century passed with little excitement, bar a proposal to upgrade one of the eastern harbours, most of the evidence of which is seen in St Catherine's Breakwater, which is one of two breakwaters that were under construction before the whole thing was called off after one had been completed and the other one had just been started. The idea of this project had been to construct a more substantial Royal Navy anchorage, which would allow for the forward basing of warships to assist with the defence of the island, as opposed to the island having to wait for reinforcements to arrive from England. This was felt necessary due to the new advances in steam technology, which would allow potentially hostile forces to sortie from their ports and reach the island much faster than British ships could respond. This leads us to the final phase of fortification development, for in 1940 German forces moved to occupy the islands. With limited food and the most advanced fortifications having been built in the age of sail, It was felt wiser to let the islands be occupied rather than engage in some kind of last stand, which would not affect the ultimate outcome of such a battle in any way other than adding substantially to the civilian body count. Jersey and the rest of the Channel Islands thus became the only British soil occupied in World War II. Having taken the islands, the Germans set about establishing a garrison, and as the war continued and would gradually, of course, turn against them, they began fortifying them to a slightly absurd degree, mostly because of the perceived morale benefits of holding British soil and the associated belief that the British therefore would do anything to get them back as a matter of priority. This belief may have been reinforced by a number of Coastal Command aerial operations in the area, attacking various German ships on their way to, from, or past the islands, and a few Special Forces raids in the mid-war period. The overall German concept seemed to be to increase the size of the garrison and the defensive works until, per square mile and per head of population, the islands became the single most heavily manned and fortified part of the Atlantic Wall by quite a considerable margin. Sadly, this would include more than 16,000 slave workers, mostly prisoners of war, who were brought in to do most of the heavy lifting, and a number of whom would die in the effort. On Jersey, this included what is now called the war tunnels in the centre of the island, which were to act as a command and control post, hospital and barracks, along with extensive anti-aircraft emplacements, and of course the more direct maritime defences on the coasts, which were made up of a series of observation and defence bunkers for troops. Most of those were simply concealed as best as possible in the sand and rock for obvious reasons, but then you also had the larger emplacements meant for more direct defence against seaborne attack. This included a number of smaller concrete casemates armed with 47mm or 105mm guns, or the nearest available equivalent, and a few much larger installations that took the form of full gun batteries, with their own rangefinders, spotting towers, magazines, accommodation, and gun barbettes, each of which would be armed with a substantial piece of artillery. The reason I mentioned or nearest available equivalent when it comes to artillery is that whilst the defence of the islands was a high priority, the majority of standardised artillery was by this point being sent to the Eastern Front, and so a lot of what was installed on Jersey was an odd mix of some regular German equipment and a variety of salvaged guns from World War I era French depots, Russian naval artillery that had been captured in the opening days of Operation Barbarossa, and other pilfered artillery from all over Europe, plus some older German guns from reserve stocks. At least one German pre-dreadnought secondary battery gun would see its final active service on the island. At the same time, some oddly rare and rather advanced weapons were also deployed. At Corbière, on the southwestern tip of the island, for example, there was an automatic mortar system designed to saturate the area, assessed as one of the possible landing sites for a counter-invasion, in dozens of mortar shells per minute, a system of which only a few were built, and no others, as far as anyone can tell, have survived. Although, because an electricity supply strong enough to run the autoloader couldn't be guaranteed at that particular end of the island, it also had a manually operated flywheel system installed as a backup and/or starter unit. The older defences of Jersey were also subject to change, with Gore Castle and Fort Elizabeth, amongst others, gaining concrete observation tower additions as part of German fortification efforts, rather to the detriment of their aesthetic value. This wasn't all, though. There were plans for even more extensive defences, including battleship-scale guns, but the D-Day landings put paid to any such ideas as the Channel Islands became progressively more and more cut off from the rest of occupied Europe. Initially, some supply and communication was possible from French ports on the Atlantic coast, but as these themselves were isolated or retaken, the extensive defences of Jersey and the other islands sat around not doing all that much until the islands themselves were surrendered at the end of the war after much privation for the local inhabitants. Having got rid of the occupiers, the post-war government wanted to remove as many reminders as possible that the occupation had occurred, and some of the bunkers were damaged in an initial attempt to destroy them. But surprisingly enough, for coastal defence bunkers, they proved to be quite tough, and certainly beyond the economic means of a small island government to exercise from the landscape to any real degree. and so most of them were left to be consumed by the environment, with their entrances blocked up and most of the guns themselves either taken out to sea and dumped in a nearby deep water trench, or, in the case of the larger pieces, which were too heavy to haul onto small or medium-sized ships on the other side of the island, were simply taken to a nearby cliff and chucked over the edge. Although, with this done at high tide, it turned out that they fetched up at the bottom of the cliff instead of entering the ocean, and so you can still see them from certain angles at low tide. A few of these guns have since been recovered and then reinstalled, as a number of the German fortifications have in later years been turned into museums. A few other bits of equipment were recovered from a tunnel that had previously been filled with that material and then had the entrance collapsed by explosives at the end of the war, although a second potentially similar tunnel is yet to be explored. With the end of World War II came the end of millennia of active maritime defence construction on the island, and the gradual redevelopment of many of them that were still surviving into museums and other civic functions. But hopefully, this primer has excited your interest in this concentration of maritime defensive history, and over the coming months, if you're not able to go there yourself, which I do highly encourage because it is a very nice place to visit, we will also be having a closer look at some of these installations in a bit more detail.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.